This year marks the 500th anniversary of Luther's Heidelberg Disputation. Harold J. Grimm's English translation in volume 31 of the American edition of Luther's works isn't quite that old yet. We can knock a zero off, but it did turn 50 just last year. Now, 51 years is not long enough for the English of the translation to start feeling stilted, but it is long enough for developments to challenge it. The Heidelberg Disputation consists of 40 theses in all, the first 28 being from theology and the last 12 being from philosophy. The version we have in the volume 31 of Luther's works does not have the proofs for the philosophical ones, only the proofs for the theological ones. This is not because of any agenda on the part of the editors, but the philosophical proofs were not in hand. They were not known at that time. It was 1979, 22 years later, when Helmar Junghans published 9 of them, the only 9 that we have, the ones for Theses 29 to 37. This is material previously unknown to modern Luther scholars, or mostly unknown at least, and I'm the one who had the privilege of translating them for a volume that was supposed to come out in 2014, but is probably delayed till 2020 now. So I have access to it. The new proofs make it clear that Grimm's translations of the philosophical theses missed a lot of their meaning. The philosophical theses, as translated in volume 31, are not very philosophical. It's easy to get the impression from them that Luther, having concluded the real work of the Disputation when he got done with his 28 theological theses, was just trying to fill out some assignment he didn't really care about, listing some disparate, non-technical philosophical thoughts, not really doing philosophy. And indeed, even without the tenor of the preceding theological theses, which is famously dismissive of the powers of human reason to know and please God, the first 2 of the theses from philosophy don't prepare the reader for much more than that. They strike a lot the same tone as the theological theses. Thesis 29, whoever wishes to philosophize safely in Aristotle must first become thoroughly foolish in Christ. Thesis 30, just as no one uses the evil of lust well unless he is married, so no one philosophizes well unless he is a fool, that is, a Christian. Likening physical lust to intellectual lust there, a very interesting point. Grimm had no trouble translating these 2 theses exactly right, and the next one also, which is, it was easy for Aristotle to suppose that the world was eternal when the human soul, in his opinion, was mortal. But then there are difficulties. Thesis 32, we have the translation that's been published in LW 31 at the top and the Latin in the middle, and then the one that's coming out, my translation, on the bottom here. You see a number of problems color-coded for you. The yellow problem is that the word is substantiales, and it's been translated material by Grimm. Now, that's a translation that would work for some contexts. It's a rough and ready one, but it's not a philosophical one. Substantial means subsisting in and of itself. Material means having to do with matter. They're not the same thing. Created things here is rendering composita. That's literally composite things, which is a technical philosophical term again, but without the context, Grimm just went with created things, kind of turning it into a theological thesis. And then it was necessary to accept that they are all material, he said, but you see the word is actually materias. It's matters. There are just as many matters as there are composite things. What Grimm doesn't know is that between Theses 31 and 32 lies an immense and highly technical proof for a claim Luther obviously thought would be very controversial, namely that Aristotle did not believe in the immortality of the human soul. This proof takes up 211 lines in the Weimar edition. For purpose of comparison, all of the shorter proofs of all the 28 theological theses put together, except for the really extended one on Thesis 6, adds up to 284 lines. So this is a really long and detailed proof. If you've ever wondered what it would look like if Luther put his mind seriously to philosophy, you owe it to yourself to read this proof, or at least to try to read it. It's very dense. One of the most telling arguments he develops in it and in the following proofs is that Aristotle considered the relationships of soul and body to be an instance of the relationship of form to matter. And since he denied that form has any existence separable from matter, he therefore also denied that the soul has any existence separable from the body. One of the angles from which he makes this argument concerns Aristotle's understanding of composite things. So a little excerpt from that long proof. Second, according to Aristotle, Physics Book 1, a composite is corruptible, and soul and body make up a corruptible continuum or composite, just as matter and form do. So composite things is the correct translation. Luther's advisedly using that word. Then for matters, he says the definition of matter in Book 1 of the Physics runs as follows. Matter is that which is the first substratum of every single thing from which a being comes to be. Surely this pronouncement holds that every individual being has its own substratum, not that all things have the same one. In fact, he says if you go with the idea that all things have their same one, there's some undifferentiated matter and form is the main deal, then we fall back into Plato's opinion, although he is criticized by Aristotle for his matter or chaos in the metaphysics. Then we have another example, 2 theses later, LW 31. If Aristotle would have recognized the absolute power of God, he would accordingly have maintained that it was impossible for matter to exist of itself alone. My translation, if Aristotle had known the absolute potency of God, he would still have maintained, that is, he did in fact maintain this, that it is impossible for matter to remain unformed. To exist of itself alone, that's a sort of a theological thing that maybe the creation can exist without the creator. But we're actually talking about unformed matter, primal matter here. So in the proofs for this, he says, it is clearly the case that in creatures it is impossible to have act without potency, as all declare. But matter is potency and form is act, so they cannot be separated. So we see 2 things there. First, he actually is saying they can't be separated. He is saying matter can't remain unformed. And so the ad hoc is still, not accordingly. He still would have maintained that if he had known that God was absolute potency, instead of actus purus, as his prime mover actually was, Aristotle's prime mover actually was, even if he had recognized the absolute potency of God, he still would have maintained it's impossible for matter to remain unformed. Luther seems to be suggesting here that God himself would be necessarily connected to primal matter, that creation would be necessary and that God would be part of it, that God would be subject to his own rules. So Luther's doing real philosophy here, something you would never guess from the LW 31 rendition. We've seen 2 examples, and we'll see a third one before I'm done. The philosophical proofs make a big difference to our understanding of the philosophical theses. Now for the question implied in my title. Do they have a similar impact on our understanding of the theological theses? We wouldn't expect it to be so great, so determinative to their very translation, as we've seen they are in the philosophical theses. However, they were composed as part of the same document. They were defended as part of the same academic exercise. We're talking about 2 halves of the same whole, so they have to shed light on each other. And so far, that exchange has been almost entirely a one-way street. Gerhard Forde, in his influential 1997 commentary on being a theologian of the cross, said, "We shall not deal with the philosophical theses here, since they would draw us farther afield than we need to go," but then summarized them briefly as having been aimed at the Aristotelian premises undergirding a theology of glory, which is true as far as it goes, but way too general. Luther was offering specific examples of how Aristotle's unchaste use of philosophy went wrong. He was not critiquing Aristotle's method, far from philosophy in general. And it's hardly just Forde who makes this one-way approach. Vitor Westphal, writing in the 2014 Oxford Handbook of Martin Luther's Theology, develops the same idea at greater length. He writes, "This distinction between the theologian of glory and theologian of the cross became the sharpest expression of Luther's rejection of the dominant canons of rationality that have been accepted as ancillary partners, handmaids of theology, guiding and ordering the theological discourse. The theses of the Heidelberg Disputation, the locus classicus of the Theologia Crucis, conclude with an often overlooked section on philosophy, which explains what these accepted canons were for the contemporary reader. The frequent polemical references to Aristotle in all but 3 of the 12 theses are figurative expressions or metonymies for speculative and rational theological constructs in general." Now, there are 2 obvious problems with this approach that wants to generalize the philosophical theses in this way. The first is that this is a characterization originally formed without the new light that the proofs have to shed. And it hasn't changed now that the new light has come. Back then, they had to be translated in light of the theological theses because that was the only context we had. But now we have more context. And the second is that when you look at that context, you see Luther praises several other philosophers by name as he's putting down Aristotle. He praises Plato in Theses 36 and 37, Pythagoras in Thesis 37, Parmenides in Thesis 38, and Anaxagoras in Thesis 39. And with Plato, he goes way beyond just giving him a good word in passing. Here's Thesis 36. Aristotle wrongly criticizes and mocks the philosophy of Platonic ideas, which is better than his own. You see how, again, the philosophical technicality of this was missed, even on this rather basic point in the LW31 translation, just the ideas of Plato. Very generic, like the things that Plato had to say were better than the things Aristotle has to say. He missed that he's talking about the theory of the forms here. And then in Thesis 36, in the proof, he says that Plato's philosophy is better than Aristotle's philosophy is plain from the fact Plato always strives for divine and immortal things, separate and eternal things, insensible and intelligible things. Because of this, he held the particular inseparable sensible things should be forsaken, since they could not be knowable on account of their instability. Aristotle, being opposed to him in every way, mocks those separate and intelligible things and ascribes them to sensible and particular and entirely human and natural things. Second, this kind of form is just whatness, or quiddity. The what is it? And is the whole of his metaphysics, and thus he has destroyed all the ideas already, putting in their place his own forms and whatnesses conjoined with matter, and mocking and denying ideas separate from matter, as is clear in many passages. But that Plato's ideas are separate is plain from the blessed Augustine, Iamblichus, and all the Platonic disputants. And so it is clear that Aristotle's philosophy crawls in the dregs of corporal and sensible things, while Plato is occupied with separate and spiritual things. In the terms of many interpreters of the Heidelberg Disputation here, Luther is praising Plato for being a theologian of glory. Thesis 37. The mathematical order, or the imitation of numbers in beings, is ingeniously maintained by Pythagoras, but more ingeniously is the participation of ideas maintained by Plato. You see, interaction is a generic term, participation is a specific term. Participation is a specifically Neoplatonic term for their metaphysics. And now get a load of this. This is amazing. The second part is clear from Plato and the Parmenides. That is, the part that's not about the Pythagoreans, whereby a most beautiful argument, he draws out that first one and idea, the Platonic one, God, until he takes all things away from it and leaves it nothing to be itself. Then he goes back and clothes that same one with all things until nothing is left in which that one is not. And there is nothing that has being unless the one is implanted within. That's participation. In this way, it is beyond all things and nevertheless within all things, just as blessed Augustine also contends in Book 1 on True Religion. But that peculiar participation and separation of the one or of idea can be understood better than can be expressed, and understood of numbers better than in reality. So he actually understands the Neoplatonic metaphysics here, and he likes it, and he thinks it's beautiful. And it captures the transcendence and immanence of God at one and the same time. And this is something that Tafferty and Tobier, etc., would unquestionably be theology of glory. But this cannot actually be smacked down and forbidden in the theological theses of the Heidelberg Disputation if he's doing it himself in the second half of that very same disputation. Now, of course, Luther was going after Aristotle because Aristotle was the philosopher of the late and high Middle Ages, the one invoked almost every time one of his contemporaries forced divine revelation to fit a shape devised by human reason. If there had been a rash of Platonically inspired bad theology in the early 16th century, I have no doubt that Luther would have written different theses not so favorable to the man. And that's not just guessing on my part, because 2 years later, in his preface to the Babylonian Captivity of the Church, we see him dismissing the authority of the ancient author Dionysius the Areopagite, Pseudo-Dionysius, as we know to call him, but Luther just had suspicions, for the reason that, and I quote, In his work, The Mystical Theology, he is more Platonizing than Christianizing. If Luther had been surrounded by Eastern Palamites instead of Western Thomists and alchemists, then I think he would have seen a lot more evidence that doctrine could be warped by Platonic philosophy too. However, given what he actually wrote, it's clear that he finds Plato to be more amenable to Christian theology than Aristotle. These theses in which he criticizes Aristotle are not just figurative expressions or metonymies for speculative and rational theological constructs in general, as Westella claims. Luther has specific complaints about Aristotle and his influence on the theologians of his day, complaints that expressly do not apply to all philosophers or philosophy in general. And this leads us to take another look at the thesis in the Heidelberg Disputation that is the one that the truck gets driven through when they try to say that theology cannot be used in any sort of a handmaiden sense, that divine impassibility, divine immutability, eternality, the whole concept of theodicy, all of these parts of philosophy that have served as a traditional prolegomenon to theology are somehow excluded as theology of glory. Thesis 19 is the one that says, that person does not deserve to be called a theologian who looks upon the invisible things of God as though they were clearly perceptible in those things which have actually happened. I have the actual Latin for that, and you see that the as though is not actually in the Latin. What it says is, the invisible things of God are not seen, and when the invisible things of God are seen, that does not qualify to be a theologian. That's what it says. It doesn't say that he's not a theologian who looks at the invisible things of God, who looks at creation as though he could see the invisible things of God. He is not called a theologian because he looks at creation and sees the invisible things of God. And considering he's quoting Romans 1:20, that's exactly what you would expect him to say, because in Romans 1:20, Paul's talking about people who do see the invisible things of God, right? And yet they do not worship and serve him as the creator, and therefore they are without excuse. And his whole argument doesn't work if he means what so many of the interpreters of the Heidelberg Disputation insist that he does mean here in this thesis. So, starting with the light that the philosophical theses show, we go back and we see that right there at ground zero, at the heart of it, the one where supposedly philosophy as a prolegomena is ruled out as theology of glory, the proof is actually mistranslated there too, and there with less reason, because they had the demonstrations. Luther says this is apparent in the example of those who were theologians and still were called fools by the apostle in Romans 1:22. So they are called fools. He's denying that they are wise men. He's denying they are actually theologians. He's not denying that they are philosophers. And so if a philosopher humbles himself to use divine revelation, also using it wisely rather than misusing it like a man would misuse the evil of lust if he were not married. If he does it properly, then he can be a philosopher and a theologian of the cross at the same time. And that's my conclusion.
Thank you very much, Dr. Phillips. We do have a few minutes here for questions, so if anybody would like to ask something, it's like Dr. Garrity might have something in mind.
Well, thank you for a very stimulating talk. I'm just wondering about the although in that translation. Is it a participle that
As though?
Yeah, did someone decide to steal the aspect off the participle, or how did that get there?
Well, it sounds like there's a quasi there, but there's no quasi there. What it is who contemplates, conspicuo is the word, who looks at the invisible things, and then intellecta, a participle, who looks at the invisible things having been understood by the things that are seen. And what Grimm did is who looks at the things that have been seen as if they have been understood. Like he packed all that into the intellecta, having been understood, became in him as if they had been understood. Which is, I mean, you should, just by reading Romans 1:20, you should know that's not what he meant. I mean, he's quoting Romans 1:20. I checked the Vulgate Latin. He's quoting Romans 1:20, and he refers to Romans 1:22 in the proof. So he definitely does not mean as though. He's talking about people who actually do but nevertheless do not worship and serve God.
I commend you for your translations and a very interesting talk, and I just had a couple of questions. I mean, Grimm's translation has sort of a fairy tale quality to it, so I think you're right to criticize. And I don't see how it can be anything what you did hitherto to lead up to this point, still. So I think you're exactly right about that. I did have two questions for you, though. One, you nitpick a little bit on the question of potentia being power versus potency. I'm not sure I really know the difference between them. So what did you have?
Well, I showed the next slide. Maybe it went past you fast because I was moving. The next slide in the proof, he uses the same word potentia, and there it's act and potentia.
What?
Act and potency. Actus and potentia in the proof, and in the thesis, it's the potentia Dei.
So it's more that he doesn't use a consistent term than the word power.
Well, he uses potentia in both places, and when he's explaining his use of potentia Dei, which normally you would translate power of God, he uses it in a sense that he clearly means potency, potentiality. Act and potency. So, and I think he's using the same word. One reason he's using the same word is because it is the same word. Power and potential are the same thing, and he's implying that Aristotle, by making God actus purus, is actually limiting God's freedom. God has no potential. God can't do what he wants to do. God's just a force. Yeah.
It was on the word idea in Latin.
Which word?
The word idea in form, or idea. I think you're exactly right to criticize that too, but I wonder why in your translation you didn't use the word form. You capitalized the word idea.
Yeah.
But you didn't use the word form. I was just wondering if it might be okay.
Well, it's because the word form shows up a lot of other places in the disputation too, in the proofs, and as forma. And so I want to distinguish, because he's talking about Aristotelian form all the way through, so I want to distinguish that this is Platonic form.
2 questions. Nice paper. It's too bad I got kind of lost at the end there. So I hope the visit would be a little bit later on, Barry Simpson. Number 1, have you gone and looked at the glosses from Luther's lectures on Romans from 1515, 1516 on 122, for instance? You might find some
Okay, yeah.
Explanation there that he's already done some of this that shows up then in these philosophical theses. Secondly, I think I'm going to guess here that is one of his quarrels with Actus Purus, that comes through not only Aristotle but Thomas, is that you cannot have any patiency in God, not just potency. You can't have suffering God, you can't have a crucified God if God is by definition Actus Purus without any patiency.
Yeah, it's a good suggestion.
The theology of the cross question going on there.
It's a limiting of God in both directions. God can't just do God.
Yeah, I can't crucify God on Calvary, for instance. Well, we talked about this a little bit last night. I think that's a good and fair reading of my former colleague Gerhard Ferde, who didn't know enough philosophy to get into the philosophical theses, but who also was very much influenced by Barth at that point, where you can't do philosophy at that time.
Very good. Thanks again, Dr. Phillips. Thanks for everybody getting in the session. We got a few minutes to get to the next one. That was interesting. Thank you very much.